Last time on the Active Self-Protection Podcast.
Immediately, both doors open simultaneously, and all of a sudden I see the foot and leg of a guy coming out and the barrel of a rifle coming up in my direction.
Hey gang, fun fact, I used to be a OC spray, pepper spray instructor for my old agency years ago. The stuff we had was pretty good, but I got to tell you, now that I've used POM, P-O-M, Peace of Mind, POM Industries OC, I know why it's the OC of choice for the Active Self-Protection team. We love their mission. We love the efficacy of their product, the flip-tap reversible clips. We love everything about POM. They have removed any excuses not to carry OC. This will solve far more problems than a firearm, and I wouldn't leave the house without it. I just bought one for my daughter and wife a little while back, and I have a good friend who's used it successfully in a real-life defensive encounter. Get one at get-ask.com/POM. Get-ask.com/POM.
And all of a sudden I see the foot and leg of a guy coming out and the barrel of a rifle coming up in my direction.
Oh boy.
So, yeah. So here's interesting. Just to add to that point we were just talking about. So my security guard also seeing exactly the same thing that I'm seeing, told me personally, like I said, but he also was testified to this in a federal trial. He said when he saw that, the thought that went through his mind was, those guys, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Those guys are crazy. What kind of a stupid prank is this? Because that Garland policeman's going to kill those guys. Well, now me and the security guard were kind of on the same page, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
I mean, that was, I immediately perceived the threat, but he didn't even find that to be a threat, I think, until they started shooting at him. Then he figured it out, obviously. But it's interesting how two people can be watching exactly the same thing and have two completely different perspectives. We ended up in the same intersection. We just came on two different roads,
right,
if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that's typical of the non-law enforcement. Not that he was non-law enforcement, because he actually had worked in a law enforcement job before he worked for the school district. But there's a lot of mental preparation that goes into working in law enforcement. And if you're not mentally prepared, the physical preparation is kind of wasted at that
100%.
point, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've said this a million times. I'm sure the listeners are tired of hearing it, but if you are in law enforcement, if you are in a combat role in the military, or if you are a self-defender with a CCW, you have to have had a conversation with yourself in your own head long before a critical incident, where you ask yourself some tough questions like, am I really willing to use this firearm to take the life of another human being to protect mine and the lives of other people? The moment of truth is not the time to have this inner monologue with yourself. It's way too late. Going back to the earlier point, we were talking about the way cops perceive things. It's not just that. I mean, if you've been on for 10 years and you've worked in an area with enough crime, believe me when I tell you, folks, as an experienced law enforcement officer, you can look at a car and be like, yeah, probably a parolee, probably got dope on board, probably got guns, or that guy walking down the street is probably on parole or probation. I could tell from the way he's walking that he has a gun probably in his waistband, et cetera, et cetera. That's not just a thing in the TV and the movies. That's a real thing. I think, Greg, you'd agree with me on that.
Oh, yeah. And is it 100%? No, but it's sure way up there.
Yeah.
I mean, you're gonna miss on one or two, but you hate to, you hear the old expression, you can't judge a book by the cover, but the reality is
you can.
There's a lot of information on the cover.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's a good book. It just means that there's a lot of information on the cover, and if you're not taking advantage of that, you're squandering some advantage or a lot of information, to say the least.
Yeah, if a crook, a knucklehead wants to skyline himself like that, and advertise that he's doing knucklehead stuff, then why wouldn't you, as a crime fighter, why wouldn't you avail yourself of that information, like you said? So at this point, these guys are out of the car. They've raised rifles towards you and or the security guard. What happens then?
Okay, so that question was asked in federal court, and I had mentioned I saw the barrel, the guy stepping out and the barrel of the rifle coming up in my direction, and one of the attorneys asked me, said, "So, Officer Stevens, when you saw that happen, and what happened next?" And the answer that I gave is significant and probably something very important with regard to our podcast here.
Mm-hmm.
And my response to that was my training kicked in.
Mm-hmm.
That was the answer I gave in federal court. I knew that what they were really asking was what was the next sequence of events. But the reality was when I saw that happen, I wasn't formulating a plan. I wasn't, I just did what I had been trained to do and been training to do for 37 years.
Mm.
I was a 37-year veteran of the department before I ever had to discharge my firearm in the line of duty. And, but I did a lot of training in 37 years. And I was I wasn't always an avid trainer. I was most of the time. But there were times in my career where I didn't really do as much training as I probably should have. But as my career moved forward and as it lengthened, I realized over and over again the value of that. And part of that was where I really learned that was my motorcycle training. Every month we would go to the practice field for 8 hours and practice riding cone patterns and emergency braking and other important things that you got to be able to do on a motorcycle to stay safe. And what really brought it to my attention, what really brought the reality of how perishable training skills are, was I'd get to the practice field and the first 15 or 20 minutes was just awkward enough for me to realize those skills in 30 days had diminished enough to where that's the necessity of coming out here every 30 days. And the same holds true with defensive tactics. The same thing holds true, probably more so with defensive tactics because it requires a lot more movement. Firearms training exactly the same. If you don't go to the range and practice, I'm telling you, your skills will diminish. The longer, it's almost exponential how fast it starts to dwindle and go away.
Yeah, it's like if you learn to speak Spanish with one of these fancy apps or one of these fancy programs, and you learn to speak fluent in Spanish in 2 months, and then you live in in Omaha, Nebraska, and never interact with anyone speaking Spanish. Guess how long that Spanish is going to last you? Not very long at all. So exactly. it's like any other skill that you learn. If you don't, I'm just going to echo what you said. If you don't keep up with it, it will go away. I remember taking a 2-week NRA class. It was law enforcement pistol and shotgun instructor class, and I think I fired more rounds in those 2 weeks than I have ever had before or since. It was a lot of shooting. I remember that after I got done, I told my wife, I'm like, I don't want to get into a shooting. I really don't. I don't think anyone does. But if I had to do it, I feel like I'm the most confident I am right now that I've ever been with my firearm skills, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's just like when you're in college and you got a big exam coming up and you have two options. You can stay home and study and prepare and be ready to go, or you can go out drinking with your buddies. Trust me, I've tried both of those. And I can tell you what the result is. But the reality is when you go into that classroom after plan B, which was hanging out with your buddies all the night before, you have the beginnings of post-traumatic stress, right? Yeah. Because you know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But if you stayed home and you really prepared and you know the material and you're ready for the exam, you're almost anxious to get in there and start and take that exam because you know you're going to do well.
Yep.
And the same thing I think holds true. That's kind of an illustration of what you just said there. You don't want to get involved in something like that, but there's something, if you do, you feel really confident about your ability to navigate that whole situation because your skills are at their highest level at that point.
Right. So back to the day in question. The answer to the question, what happened after they got out of the cars, excuse me, let me rephrase that. Back to the day in question, the question I asked was, what happened after they got out of the car and started raising rifles? Your answer was, my training kicked in. And I think we've explained what that means. And I know exactly what that means, by the way. Who pulls the trigger first?
Mike, I don't know. Here's the thing. The first thing that I remember and have a memory of was I'm getting a sight picture on the passenger. I don't remember drawing my weapon out of my holster. I don't remember establishing my grip. I don't remember any of that stuff. It just happened. And it obviously happened pretty quick because I was ready to engage. And I'll be honest with you, I couldn't tell you whether I got the first round off, he got the first round off, or we did it simultaneously. I have no recollection of that. All I know is as soon as I perceived the threat, I proceeded with my only course of action, and that was to try and stop that threat with my handgun.
Can I ask the make, model, caliber of the gun you were carrying that day?
I was carrying a Glock 21 45 caliber.
Okay. And do you know the capacity of those magazines?
There's 13 in the mag, 1 in the gun.
And how many mags do you have on you at the time?
The 1 in the gun and 2 extras.
Okay. So we don't know who shot first, but you, at the moment things started to go down, you were just going into sort of, I call it automatic mode, but you knew what was happening. You perceived it quickly and you got a sight picture. Was there any other officers anywhere around that were involved in this shooting?
Not until after it was all but done. Okay. I had members of the SWAT team come to my rescue. As soon as they heard shots fired and so on, they came running and they took up a position behind my police car, and actually did discharge their weapon. A couple of them did fire a couple of rounds, but they were both down by the time they got there, and they were just trying to make sure the threat was completely eliminated.
Do you know how many rounds you expended in the course of this firefight?
I do. I fired 14 rounds.
14 rounds. Do you know how many hits on each individual?
I don't, and that was difficult. Autopsy was pretty inconclusive. There were some rounds, it was just hard to tell because there was a couple of rifle shots that hit them, and it was really kind of hard to tell which ones were which. And I'm sure that I didn't have 14 hits. But I'm also firing at 2 assailants, and they're both moving.
Right.
So the fact that I hit them at all is somewhat satisfying. I got enough to be effective. I can promise you that.
At about what distance were you? Do you know?
We started about 10 yards apart, and then they closed some, and I closed some on that.
Okay.
On them. So got pretty close at the end.
Digressing for just a moment. I was reading up on this a little bit, and I guess it turns out, and if you can't talk about this, I totally understand, but it sounds as though the FBI had these guys on their radar before this ever went down. Did Garland PD get a call saying, hey, these guys might be en route? Did that actually happen? Because it was reported, but it wasn't confirmed.
And I'm not going to go a lot deep into this because There was some controversy that kind of surrounded that. But to my knowledge, we never got any notification at all from the FBI that these guys were in the area, or that they had any inclination that they were in the area, or any of those kind of things. So, the assumption would be that they didn't know that they were in the area. One of the guys was actually, he had been handled by the FBI on a previous terrorist charge where he had lied to them and was on probation, or had been on probation. And he was kind of in the, on their list, so to speak. And, but the other guy, who was his roommate, wasn't on any kind of watch list or anything with the FBI, which is kind of interesting. You'd think the roommate of a guy that was on the list would have to be, somebody that you'd have an interest in. But that's, I don't know much about the FBI or how they do their business. And, but to my knowledge, and I'm pretty assured of this, the FBI never indicated to us that there was any, inclination that there was people in the area that were going to make this attack.
Yeah, I worked on several task forces with FBI agents, and individually they are salt of the earth, very bright, very smart, very capable agents. It's just when you get their management involved and get too many of them together in one place. Like if you want to draw FBI agents, just hold a press conference and they will just materialize out of nowhere. With that said,
you said that. I didn't say that.
No, you said nothing of the sort. I said it, and I stand behind it. No, they're good folks for the most part.
They are.
So post shooting, you've got the whole world there. Obviously, was there any concern after the shooting stopped that there was IEDs or attackers possibly? Was that ever something that anybody was concerned about immediately following the shooting?
Oh, absolutely. Matter of fact, during briefings, we had talked about IEDs, both body-borne and vehicle-borne, and and I don't mind. I can walk you through the whole firefight incident if you would like.
Yeah, please.
And
please
that enters into it. Actually, to be honest with you. So let me just tell you the story. So these guys pull up, and we're at the point now where my training kicked in. Okay, Let's move forward from there.
Sure.
So I've drawn my weapon. I'm acquiring a sight picture. The passenger's getting out of the car, got his rifle coming up in my direction. I fired several rounds on him, and he falls to the ground and drops his rifle. It's within proximity, but he it's not in his hands. I have two assailants. So as soon as he goes down, I immediately direct my attention to the driver, who's gotten out of the car, and he's toward the back of the car. He's got his rifle up, shouldered, and I'm assuming he's shooting at the security guard. But I'm not really looking that direction. I'm looking at him. And as it turns out, the security guard, his name's Bruce. We'll just call him Bruce.
Okay.
Bruce wasn't a youngster. He was closer to my age than he probably would like to have been. But in any case, for an old guy, Bruce could move along pretty good. He was headed to the Mexican border because he had no way to defend himself.
Right.
And he's got 7.62 by 39 rounds whizzing by him, I guess.
That is a motivator.
Yeah, that gets you moving.
Yeah.
But anyway, when I turned to the driver, like I said, he's bladed off to me because he's got his rifle up and apparently shooting at Bruce. And so what's center of mass for me, which is what we're trained to aim for, that's how we stop threats, is hit the largest part of the target, which is center mass. Well, center of mass now is going to be his left shoulder and arm and kind of his upper torso there, which is a much narrower target than if he was facing me, obviously. And so I fired several rounds on him, and he goes down similar to what the passenger had done. Drops his rifle. Like I said, it's in proximity, but once again, I've got two assailants to deal with. I had concerns about the passenger because I didn't know just how incapacitated he may or may not been.
Right.
And so I redirected my attention to him. He was laying on the ground. He had his hands up around his upper chest and kind of throat area, and his hands were moving around. Now, another thing that probably should describe, these guys are wearing like dark colored military style, kind of like BDU kind of clothing. And they're wearing soft body armor. They also have load bearing vests with multiple magazines in each one of the vests. And so I'm looking at the passenger on the ground. He's moving his hands around his upper part of his load bearing vest and so on. And I had a great concern that he might be trying to push a button, pull a pin. The IED thing now comes into focus. Now he's a threat because I don't know whether that car is loaded with explosives or if they're wearing backpacks, whether those backpacks had explosives in them, whether they had them packed around. They could have been wearing a vest with explosives for all I know. Pretty hard to determine in the few seconds that I had to take a look at him. So I re-engaged the passenger, fired several more rounds on him, he kind of quit wiggling around quite so much. I still had concerns about the driver. Reacquired him. He had pushed himself up, kind of slumped back down, wasn't doing a whole lot. But once again, my concern about the IED thing still left me, believing that he was a threat if he is not completely out of the fight. Had a couple of more rounds left. I fired the last couple of rounds that I had, and my slide locks back without having to think about what I'm doing based on my training again. I immediately reloaded in a tactical fashion. My weapon was up. I kept my eyes down range, dropped my mag, retrieved one off of my belt, fed it in the mag well, recharged my weapon, got a second sight picture. And then the driver hadn't really moved much or anything, so I felt pretty confident that he was completely out of the fight. I again redirected my attention to the passenger, who was not moving much, but he was moving some, and I started to close on him in order to make sure that threat was completely eliminated. And that's when my SWAT compadres were from behind my car were yelling at me, trying to get my attention to get me out of to a point of safety, to a point of cover.
Were you able to even hear them at that point, or were you having auditory exclusion?
I did experience auditory exclusion. However, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But really, I think it was more about attention. It's kind of like when I'm watching the Cowboy game, my wife's yelling at me from the kitchen.
Right.
I know something's going on back there, but I'm not really paying a whole lot of attention. I think that was more the case, at that time. But I did experience auditory exclusion, which is a phenomenon that I had heard about, never had experienced previously.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of, when they finally did get my attention and got me back to a point of cover. You could whisper in my ear and I could hear everything that you said. And now you go out to the range and you get two guys with AK-47s, which is probably the loudest rifle known to mankind.
Pretty darn loud.
And they got about 35 rounds off between them. And I fired 14 rounds out of my Glock. So, if you get all those guys together, shooting AK-47s and my 14 rounds out of my 45 in about 12 or 13 seconds is my guesstimate on how long this firefight actually lasted. Without hearing protection, you're not going to hear much of anything other than a loud whining sound. After that
for a while.
For a while.
Yeah.
But when I went back and was brought to a point of cover, you could whisper in my ear, and I'm telling you, I could hear everything without any problem. It's an amazing phenomenon.
How about ocular occlusion, or they call tunnel vision? Do you experience that as well, or no?
No, not really. If any at all, maybe right at first, when I'm looking at I'm looking specifically at this guy getting out in that rifle. But I had two assailants, so I really didn't. Your brain's an amazing piece of equipment. It does things when it needs to do things and doesn't do things when it doesn't need to do it. And that tunnel vision would have been a detriment to me because, like I said, I had two assailants, so I had to have some peripheral vision and the ability to see a wider spectrum than just looking through a drinking straw.
And then the other question I always ask someone who's been in an incident like this is, did the sense of time passing speed up, slow down, or remain sort of normal?
Seemed rather normal to me.
Okay.
It's interesting with auditory exclusion. What I heard sounded like muffled automatic weapon fire. That's kind of all I heard. And the rounds that I fired with my 45, I felt more than and saw the action. I mean, you could see the slide move and so on, but I actually felt it more than I heard it. I know that sounds maybe a little weird, but that with auditory exclusion, it was protecting, my body was protecting itself. But I knew my weapon was functioning correctly. Everything was fine. That wasn't a problem. I just thought it was an interesting phenomenon. And it took me about a week before I remembered two very significant things about the firefight itself. And those were one, every round I fired, I got a sight picture. I remember, I mean, like I said, it was a few days later before I actually remembered that, but I remember it vividly. And it wasn't always a perfect sight picture, but I always had a sight picture. That front sight was between the rear posts, at some point. And the other thing that was interesting, this goes back to training once again, as does the sight picture thing, is my rate of fire was not this spastic, fast as I could squeeze rounds off firing. It was very rhythmical. It was boom, 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 boom. Then I moved over to the driver, the same thing, boom, boom, boom. So the reality is that's as fast as Greg Stevens can fire his Glock 21 45 caliber handgun and hit what he's shooting
at 10 yards. For the folks listening who may not know much about shooting, sight picture is simply you aligning the front and rear sights of any firearm. Could be a rifle with iron sights or a handgun with iron sights, and then aligning that front sight roughly in the center of whatever it is you're shooting at. That completes a sight picture. There's sight alignment, which means your sights are lined up properly, but without what you're shooting at centered behind that, it's not a complete sight picture. So that's what he means by that. I find it very, very interesting that it took you a few days to remember, hey, I had a pretty decent sight picture every time I pulled the trigger. I hear this a lot on this show where people remember not always super significant things, but things that are relevant to what happened during their incident. They'll remember it 5 or 6 or 7 days or 2 weeks later. Was there anything else like that popped up to you, that occurred to you later on that you hadn't realized in the moment or right afterwards?
No, that was really the two most significant things. A day or so later, the reality of what had just happened and the fact that I'm still talking and breathing kind of hit me a little bit to like, holy mackerel, I have no real reason to be still on this earth. I was outgunned, I was outmanned, I had no cover. There was one other thing, and it didn't take me as long to remember this, but really the only first conscious thought that I had when this encounter started, like I said, I don't remember drawing my firearm. I don't remember, I remember one of the first things I remember is getting a sight picture.
Right.
But I do remember thinking to myself that I needed to take the fight to them. Under the I had nowhere to retreat to. I had no cover. I had, so my thought was the only way I'm going to survive this is if I take the fight to them. And I actually, that was my mindset. And I actually closed, some as I was, I didn't, there's a controversy about moving and shooting. Some people can do it. Some people can't. I'm not any good at it. So I can shoot then move, shoot then move. But doing them at the same time is kind of wasting bullets for me. I don't really hit much, but I've never practiced it a whole lot either. So that's part of that. But I do remember that conscious thought of, hey, if you're going to survive this, you're going to have to take the fight to them. If you don't have any chance. And the reality was the chance of surviving it, even taking the fight to them, was pretty minuscule if you want to know the truth.
Yeah.
But that was the other conscious thought. But it's interesting, like you said, a few days later, remembering things and remembering them rather vividly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you're familiar with, I'm sure you are, and probably a lot of your audience will be too. A great author and a friend of mine. His name is retired Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He wrote the book on combat.
Mm-hmm.
And he addresses that in his book with great detail. And it's funny. I before he and I actually we get an opportunity to present together on occasions, and he'll introduce me, and he's a very very selfless and gracious man. I have a great I think a lot of him, and he's been a great mentor to me as far as being a being in front of an audience and helping me to understand the important things that the audience needs to hear and wants to hear.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, he's his book. I had bought it years ago before he and I became friends, and I read the book. And then when we started spending some time together and presenting something together, I decided to reread at least portions of that book. And I was reading through that particular part of it that talks about what to expect after being involved in a critical incident, involved in some kind of a shooting attack or something. And as I'm reading that, I'm thinking to myself, this guy wrote this book long before he met me, but how did he write this book about me before he met me?
Right.
Because it was so right on the money. And that's just one small thing. The memory lapse, temporary memory lapse, and the things that you remember vividly, and even sometimes distorted memories of what happened.
Right.
That can happen as well. And all of them are okay. That's the important thing. All of that's okay. It's just, and everybody's a little bit different.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. One of our sponsors is Firearms Legal Protection, and Terry Johnson over there and I have done a few videos on the Extra Channel about for private citizens mainly. But what do you do right after you've been in a defensive encounter as a private citizen, not as LE? And his advice is shut up. And when the cops show up, don't start blurting things out right away. Part of the reason for that is exactly what you just said, is that your immediate recollection of what just happened may not be completely accurate. And it's a weird phenomenon, but I'm sure you've heard of this where, and I've had officers or deputies on the show that tell me they watched, a dash and badge cam of their incident, and stuff happened that they don't remember, and stuff didn't happen that they thought it happened. And it was clear on the tape. Correct. And it was different than their recollection. So there was no audio or video of this, I assume, of this incident.
No, as Murphy's Law would have, we had one of those tower, man tower things, like you'll see at Walmart or whatever. To prevent car break-ins and all that stuff. And they have cameras on them, and it was manned and all that. And just a little while before this all happened, that thing decides to malfunction, and we had to bring it down. Otherwise, we'd had a video of the whole dang thing. But that's, wasn't meant to be. But, those things happen. And part of that happened to me too. When I made my statement to the police department, you got to, since I was involved in this thing, this was a homicide investigation.
Right.
And when I made my statement to the detectives at the police department, in my head, I had fired 15 rounds, but the round count didn't bear that out. And the last round that I thought I had fired, my brain had already gone there. Remember, I told you I was approaching the passenger after I'd reloaded, because I was still concerned about that threat. In my brain, somehow, I thought I had fired that extra round after I reloaded. But that's when they took me back to a point of cover, got my attention. It never happened.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
So those things can happen. The other thing was the detectives were actually kind of surprised. When I said I'd fired 15 rounds, they said, well, that's not what the round count would show. And I said, well, and they told me it's 14. They said, but the fact that you missed by one round is kind of pretty amazing, because most of the time, officers, when they're involved in these things, they'll say they fired 2 rounds and they fired 18, or they'll say they fired 18 and they fired 3.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't imagine how anybody could keep track of their round count during a gunfight. It just seems impossible to me. Like, you'll hear people criticize cops because they didn't do it. They didn't top off after the first, 11 or 12 rounds of their 17 round magazine. And I'm over here like, I have no idea how you keep track. In the midst of a gunfight, how you keep track of how many rounds you've expended. I'm going to shoot until the threat goes away, or I get to slide lock, one of the two.
Right. And that's why you practice reloading. And I tell people when I present, especially, When you're at the range training and practicing, um, every time I reload my weapon at the range, whether it's the end of a drill or if it's just because I'm finished shooting that round or whatever, I reload my weapon like somebody's shooting at me.
Like you mean it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Because if you drop that mag into your hand and you stick it in your back pocket under duress, you're going to do exactly that. You're going to drop that mag in your hand and stick it in your back pocket. And needless to say, that's not going to enhance your tactical reload.
There's some lore. I'm sure you've heard of it. There was a shootout, back to our friends in the FBI. There was a shootout in Miami, I believe it was, FBI agents versus, I believe it was bank robbers. And FBI agents were killed in the course of this gunfight, and they had reloaded their revolvers. And during the investigation, they found empty shell casings, empty brass in the offside pocket of these agents. Because when they went to the range, they would practice reloading, and they would dump the brass into their hand and then put it in their pocket and then reload. That's how they train. So if that's how you train, that's how you're going to fight. I'm not super strict about how you reload when you're doing administrative stuff, but the point is it can't hurt to do that every time you reload. You're only building more of a neural pathway to do that every single time. And there's a really fun drill you can do, folks at home. When you're at the range, it doesn't cost you a lot of ammo for reloading. You just load one round into a magazine, put that in the chamber, leave the rest of the magazine empty, and then have another magazine with one round in it. And you draw, shoot the one round, get that reloaded as quickly as you can, and shoot the second round, and do it on a timer. And lo and behold, you got a really inexpensive, simple reload drill. But you're absolutely right, especially for LE. Reloading is so critical in getting it done quickly and effectively. And, for example, not missing the mag well and not putting the mag in backwards and all the other sorts of things that can go wrong under stress. That's something you should have down pat. It sounds like you did. You said something earlier about coming to this sort of realization a day or two or three later, where you're like, man, I really shouldn't be here. Like, I can't believe that went down the way it did. Here I am, one guy with a single stack 45 or whatever it was, versus two guys with AK-47s. The odds of me surviving that, never mind surviving it without any holes in me, are pretty slim. Did that sort of feeling, or I guess you might call it, I don't know, that realization, was there any anxiety, any PTS associated with this incident for you? And if so, how did it manifest itself?
Well, interestingly, though, no, there wasn't any PTS, to be honest with you. It was just a realization that when you start examining the facts of what happened, you go, it's good to be here.
Yeah.
And people ask me on occasion, they'll say, well, if they got to fire that many rounds, how did they not hit you? And I said, well, when you're taking 45 rounds, that can screw up your aim a little bit. And I said, that goes back to that decision on my part to take the fight to them. And I became tried to become the aggressor in the battle. That may have been singularly one of the things that saved my life. Was they weren't expecting that response. They were, I would assume, expecting me to try and go to a point of cover or something else, and thought they might, have better success. But all of a sudden, when they're taking rounds, and those old 230 grain jacketed hollow points hitting you, I don't care if you're wearing body armor or not. That's like getting hit with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, it's going to get your attention.
That's not going to make aiming easy by any means.
Right.
And pointing and shooting a rifle is all fine and good, but it's not. I mean, any firearm, if you're not getting a sight picture, if you're not aiming it, chances of you hitting are pretty slim most of the time.
That leads me to my next series of questions. So post shooting, all the dust settles. There's an investigation. The FBI is involved, and I know you can't maybe give me all the details of that, but at some point, a couple things happen. One is you testify in federal court in Phoenix. What was can you tell us just an overview of why that was and what that case was about? Since, I mean, your part in the case had been over and done with. You'd taken care of these two guys, and why would they need you out there to testify in that case? Or can you discuss it?
Yeah, I can discuss it. There's a lot of information on the internet if you kind of know how to dig it up. But so ultimately, there were 3 court trials on 3 different individuals related to this case, in addition to the 2 young men that lost their lives there at the Colo Center. And they were all co-conspirators in this particular event. So the first trial that was in Phoenix, the main co-conspirator was a guy that had provided them the weapons and taken them out in the desert to do some training with them and that kind of stuff. And he got convicted in 20 and got 35 years in federal penitentiary or something for his part in this thing.
Mm-hmm.
The second guy was, he was arrested, and I believe it was in North Carolina. He was involved in this thing, had contact, been texting with these guys and involved somehow in this thing. And he was from the Akron, Ohio area. So they tried him in Akron for some reason. I had to go up there. I didn't end up testifying in that. The attorneys decided to stipulate to my testimony. I think they didn't want me to get up there and tell that story again, because when I told it in Phoenix, the jurors were kind of all on the edge of their seat, and they were really interested in what I wanted to say. And I don't think the defense attorney had much interest in them hearing any more from me.
If I was their defense attorney, I want to keep you as far away from my jury as I possibly could.
Right. So, and then the third guy was back in Phoenix again, and that was a guy that was he did some witness tampering and lied to the FBI and that kind of stuff, trying to change the course of some things. And he ended up getting convicted as well. So there were those 3 co-conspirators that we know about, which brings me to something else I like to mention, when I'm presenting, and that is, I'm not a big believer in the lone wolf attack mindset. I just don't think that there's a whole lot of that really went on, especially back then. I think these folks that were, these kinds of terrorists were much better and are much better connected than we would like to give them credit for. It's too easy nowadays. The technology that we have now, goodness gracious, what you and I look at on the web is just a scratch of the surface. There's so much more of that that I have no idea how to get to, but the people that want to get there can figure it out, or can get that information. And that's pretty scary, actually. So, I just think that these folks are a lot greater threat a lot of times than we want to give them credit for.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. There was another incident, unfortunately ended very, very poorly, at a nightclub in Orlando where a guy pledged allegiance to ISIS and then went in there and shot a whole bunch of people. And I think people were very quick to be like, oh, anyone can pledge allegiance to ISIS at the last minute and go do a thing. It doesn't mean they're ISIS. Well, I don't know, man. If before committing mass murder, you're pledging allegiance to a terrorist organization, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and say, yeah, you're a member of ISIS. I'm sure they embraced it once it happened. So sure. That's an interesting point.
Well, and the passenger on the incident there at the Colwell Center, just before he mounted the attack, he actually sent a text out and to somebody significant in the ISIS organization in Syria. So these aren't, you want to think of them as fringe people, but the reality is they were, the organization, ISIS as the organization, was phenomenal at recruiting people here in the United States. Al-Qaeda, when they mounted the attack on the Twin Towers, they had to bring people to the United States in order to have that facilitated. They figured out, if we can eliminate that part of it and we have people already here, how much easier is that going to be? And I think that was the strategy that ISIS took on.
Yeah. I worked a couple units in the early 2000s post 9/11 and saw a lot of the inside baseball on that, and can't really talk about it, but I can assure you that they were the network of people helping out the hijackers was a lot bigger than you might think at first blush. And same thing. It sounds like these guys had some infrastructure. It sounds like if you're saying they were out in Phoenix with someone arming them and training them, and they're sending text messages, I'm like I said, if you call yourself a member of ISIS and start shooting people, I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna go, yeah, you're a member of ISIS. And I want to say that ISIS or ISIL or whatever they were calling themselves at the time, they proudly took credit for this. Isn't that right, or am I getting that wrong?
Oh, here's the thing. You've worked with the FBI, so you understand the flow chart of information from the FBI, right?
Uh-huh.
It's an arrow pointing one direction.
Yeah.
There is no return arrow. Yeah. So you give them information and they say thank you.
Yep.
And that's pretty much the way that works. So, and they sure don't talk to me. At best, if they talk to anybody, they might talk to some administrative folks at our department, but I never got any really very much information at all regarding that. And when I did get it, it was secondhand anyway. But I think you're right. I think that these guys were legit ISIS sympathizers and activists, and I think the FBI recognized that, and I think that ISIS also did revel in the fact that they mounted this attack. It's just, I don't think they were as excited the fact that it didn't turn out the way they had hoped.
Probably not. They weren't counting on Greg Stevens. That's what the problem was for them. So,
they weren't counting on Greg Stevens being trained and ready to go.
Right. Yeah, and I talk about this on our badge cam videos all the time. As law enforcement, no matter what level of law enforcement you're at, whether it's federal, state, local, whether you're a court security officer or you are on a tactical team, you know exactly how good your skill level is when it comes to things like defensive tactics and firearms. And if you know that you are deficient in something, you owe it to yourself and to your partners and to the community to go practice those things and get better at them. Or if you haven't practiced them in a while, to go out and practice them some more. Because I think a critical element of your incident was your level of confidence when this thing went down. If you hadn't been to the range, in 6 months since the last qual, and gun hadn't broken leather other than to put it away in a safe at the end of the day, I think that might have ended up a lot differently. I think you might have been like, oh boy, I better get to cover, and then formulate a plan rather than be the aggressor.
Right. I talk about training quite a lot when I'm presenting, and I've kind of got my own way of describing my opinions and my perspective on training, and it's kind of a 3-part thing. And if you want, if you'll indulge me, I'll be glad to share that with you.
Absolutely.
So, I talk to people, and especially when I'm talking to a law enforcement audience, I'll tell them, how many people in this room, and I won't make them raise their hand because they won't. You know how cops are.
Yep.
But I'll tell them, how many times have you gotten that email that says next Wednesday and Thursday you need to be at this location for this kind of training? And your reaction to that is a deep sigh, and your eyes roll back in your head, and you're like, oh my God. And we've all done it, myself included. But the reality is training's a gift. It's a gift. It's your agency saying you're important. You're an important part of this organization. We want you to be the best that you can be at what you do, because that's good for you. That's good for the organization. It's good for the public we serve. And so instead, the perspective needs to be that you're receiving a gift, not a burden, but a gift. And you need to embrace that. And if you can change that mindset a little bit, I think that's helpful. The other thing, the next part of that is when you do get to go to training, whether it's firearms, tactical, something or other, or report writing, whatever the heck it is, getting the training itself is just the first step. The next step is you got to practice what you're trained to do. If you don't practice it, it goes away.
Right.
It's just very perishable. and it doesn't take long, to say the least. So that's what I call training your hands. And, you got to get the training, you got to attend it, and then you got to practice what you're trained to do. And that's training your hands. The next thing I talk about too is when I was a motorcycle officer, or all throughout my police career, when I got ready to stop a car, or when I made a patrol call and I was going up to a house or whatever, I ran a bunch of scenarios through my head about what could potentially happen here.
Mm-hmm.
What am I going to do if a gun pokes out the window of that car? What is my best defense to that? What if the passenger door opens and somebody takes off running? Am I going to chase them, or am I not going to chase them? What if I see the backup lights come on in the car? What am I going to do there? Not so big a deal in a car, but it's a lot bigger deal on a motorcycle, trust me. And so I would mentally go through, and if I walk up to a house on a family disturbance, when I knock on the door, what are some potentials of things that can happen, and what is my best reaction to that? So I've kind of pre-thought some of these things. So if something does happen, I'm not standing there formulating a plan. I've already kind of thought it through. I'm more going to react based on what I've already thought of. And I call that training your head. So I've trained my hands. I've gotten the training. I've practiced what I'm trained to do. I've gone through some scenarios and so on. So I've trained my head. And then I tell my audience what that does is it trains you in your heart. That's what makes you able to respond and perform at your highest level under the most difficult of circumstances. There's nothing special about Greg Stevens. I'm just a guy. You call 911 and I'm liable to show up. I'm just another guy that's a policeman, loved what he did for 40 years. And, but I'm not a national match pistol shooter. I'm not a gigantic guy that can beat up anybody in the whole wide world. I'm not Superman. I'm not any of that stuff. I'm just a guy. But I'm a guy that was able to perform at his highest level under the most difficult of circumstances because I was prepared. And there's every listener out here that's listening to this podcast is equally as capable of performing at a very high level if you're prepared to do whatever it is that performance requires.
Absolutely. I love that. And I really, really appreciate you mentioning, I call it mental reps. I'm sure I didn't come up with that, but just, if you're a cop, you're sitting on surveillance, or it's the middle of the night, nothing going on, you're driving around, go over some mental reps in your head. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't take a lot of time. But, if this happens, what would I do? If that happens, what would I do? And I like the fact that you said, hey, if I'm approaching a vehicle, before I get off the bike, I'm thinking, okay, what if this happens, then what? What do I do then? I think that's outstanding training advice. You got an award from the governor of Texas. Is that correct?
Well, actually, I got more than one, but I got an award from the Texas Department of Public Safety. Their highest award that they offer non-department members.
Okay.
I was brought down to Austin, and it was presented to me by the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, and it was kind of a cool event, and got to have some people there to witness that. I also got invited to the White House and received a Medal of Valor, a law enforcement Medal of Valor from President Obama in 2016. That was pretty interesting event, to say the least.
Right. As I told you before, we eschew the evils of politics on the show to the extent that we can, unless it involves the Second Amendment, and then we know on which side our bread is buttered. But the fact that happened, I think is I think it's pretty cool. Not everybody can say they've been to the White House to get an award from the president, regardless of who that president may have been. Greg, was there anything else you wanted to touch on before we part ways? Because my computer's about to turn into a pumpkin here in about 10 minutes.
Well, I tell you what, Mike, something I think that's important and that we haven't really touched on is there's a component to training and to being an armed defender, a sheepdog, as so to speak. I think there's a spiritual fitness that you have to have as well. I'm a man of faith. and I'm not a theologian, but I am a man of faith, and and needless to say, I can with great conviction tell you, well, I love the Lord, and the Lord has loved me my whole life, and I've been around a little while. I'm not as young as I once was, but it's I've been blessed over and over and over again, not just at the Curtis Colwell Center, but but I think a component to anybody that wants to be a defender, that wants to be a sheepdog and help guard the flock, so to speak. I would encourage you to delve into your faith, whatever your faith may be, um, and do that training as well. I think that's an important component in being prepared to take on the most difficult situations if they arise, and you're asked to do that. And let me just close with this. I can tell you, Mike, on May 3rd, 2015, it was as though God reached down, he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, I'm going to protect you, but you got to do something with these guys. And it's by his grace and to his glory that I get to sit here today and enjoy this podcast between the two of us. My faith played a big role in being able to share this with you today. And I always like to give credit where credit's due.
You know, we let our Jesus flag fly pretty high around these here parts, active self-protection. Christ is the center of everything that we do, and we make no bones about that. Greg, I want you to know I consider you a friend. I really enjoyed this talk. I really appreciate you coming on and letting our listeners know what went on that day and what went on before and after. And you got my number, you got my email. If there's anything I can ever do for you, please do not hesitate to let me know.
Well, Mike, it's been a real pleasure. We met over the phone a couple of times. One of these days, I do get the opportunity to travel quite a bit and do some presentations for not only law enforcement, but we do some church safety stuff in addition to that, and any number of things. I got to be a participant in a 2A day up in Des Moines, Iowa, a few weeks ago, which was really cool. No telling when I might be out in the Arizona area there, and I'd be mighty disappointed if we didn't get a chance to get together and enjoy a meal together or something like that.
Perhaps a refreshing beverage.
Yeah, perhaps. I wasn't going to bring that up, but that sounds like a good idea to me.
All right, Greg, man, I can't thank you enough. Take care.
Yes, you too.
All right, folks, that concludes our main interview, and that means it's time for the Gutowski Files, either starring or featuring Stephen Gutowski, depending on how you look at it. Stephen is the founder of theweeklyreload.com and the host of the Weekly Reload podcast, available on all of your major podcast networks and on YouTube, to include clips. If you're taking a break for a few minutes and you want to watch a little short something, he's got nice clips in there for you. And he can get it a day early if you're a member over at thereload.com. Stephen, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Still having some pollen issues over here in beautiful
those allergies.
Tucson, Arizona. Yeah, it's bad. I never had allergies till I moved to Arizona. It's the only downside so far of living here, other than coyotes and roadrunners.
And the constant heat too.
Yeah.
Would be another issue.
Well, right now it's like 75 and sunny. I'm not complaining. It's going to get miserable here soon, and then in November we go from miserable back to smug. But I digress. So this week we are talking about yet another state has passed a bill to approve permitless carry, or constitutional carry as it's sometimes called. This time it is Georgia Governor Brian Kemp who signed a bill into law. This is very encouraging. I feel like this is I don't know. I feel like we're winning when it comes to this issue, because there's so many states now that either are shall issue CCW or they're permitless carry. And I think it's wonderful, because I don't think that CCW laws prevent any bad guy who wants to carry a gun from carrying a gun. He's going to do what he wants. And when he's found with a gun, he hasn't committed any other crime, the results of him being arrested are usually fairly mild. So, Stephen, tell us about this. And I wish we did a soundboard. I want sound effects for like a little party popper And one of those New Year's Eve things every time we have another state that passes permitless carry, maybe some music. Anyway, so talk to us about this. How did this go down?
Yeah, so Governor Brian Kemp, who's the Republican incumbent there, signed the bill into law on Tuesday of I believe the 11th of April, and now they're the 25th state. It's officially half of the country is governed by permitless carry at this point. In Georgia, it means that anyone over the age of 21 who can legally possess a firearm. So, people who are prohibited, felons and domestic violence, perpetrators, people adjudicated mentally ill, they obviously still can't carry a gun legally because they can't even possess one legally in the first place. But everyone else can now carry concealed without a permit in the state of Georgia and in half the entire country, which is a remarkable shift over really a very short period of time. You're in Arizona, which happened to be the third state to adopt this policy, and that was in 2010.
Yeah.
So it's been a dozen years, and you've had 23 states adopt the same policy in that time, which is really quite incredible. And then if you go back a little bit further, because you were mentioning shall issue as well, if you go back to the 1980s, you couldn't legally concealed carry almost anywhere in the country.
Right.
So the sea change has been incredible. And right now, permitless carry has really only cropped up in red states where Republicans control all three branches of the state government, or all three levels. And so it hasn't had as much momentum in purple states or blue states at this point, but certainly it's had an incredible amount of momentum in those red states. I mean, you're talking 5 states a year, really, or the last couple of years have been passing this policy.
Yeah, that's crazy in the best possible way. I would love to see a study done maybe 5 years from now on all of these permitless carry states, just to show, just statistics really. Has violent crime gone up or down? Have shootings gone up or down? Have mass shootings gone up or down? I think that would be really enlightening. And I'm willing to go out on a branch, on a limb here, and say that odds are things either stayed the same or got better as far as rates of crime go. Do we know offhand how hard this was to get through the legislature in Georgia? Do you know anything about that? Because, the governor doesn't do an executive order for this sort of thing. It has to be a bill passed by the legislature, which the governor then signs. So do we know how hard it was or wasn't for them to get this done?
It was fairly difficult. Kemp actually promised this policy back in 2018 when he first ran for governor. And so obviously it's taken him 4 years to actually get it into law. And they had considered doing it last year, but it got pulled after the Atlanta mass shooting that had occurred. And so, it's happening this year, which is kind of right at the deadline for Brian Kemp, at the very least, because he's now up for election, and he's running in a tough primary against the former Senator David Perdue, has been endorsed by former President Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is actually spending a bunch of money in the primary against running attack ads against Kemp. So keeping this promise is probably going to be a significant boon for his reelection campaign, especially in the primary. And then he's going to face off against likely Stacey Abrams again in the general election if he makes it there, where he's going to need all the support he can get, because Georgia has obviously been trending more blue recently. They put 2 Democratic senators into the Senate in 2020. So he's going to need a lot of momentum. So it's a pretty big deal there politically as well. And that race is really very important, because you've got the Trump showdown in the primary, and then you have this showdown between a star on the Democratic Party and Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. So this policy is going to be at the middle of all that.
Yeah, it's a lot of moving parts. All right, folks, a little inside baseball here. If you made it this far into the podcast, you might care about this, but this is the last Gutowski Files to be taped at the glorious Active Self-Protection Podcast World Domination Headquarters, located inside my wife's walk-in closet. We are moving houses, therefore, I'm going to move into my wife's new walk-in closet for the studio, which is very exciting. And so I'm going to cut this short because I got to go meet the pool guy, Steven. You know what I mean?
Well, congratulations, and I'm looking forward to the brand new office.
God willing, we're going to make this. I really want to make this a video also podcast. So
yeah,
that's the goal. But I just need a better space, I guess, is the bottom line. So I can have something cool like what I see behind you, which, folks, hopefully this goes video, you'll see his cool setup behind him. It's very, very neat. So, Steven, man, I thank you for being here. Folks, go over to thereload.com, and carefully consider getting a membership. Steven relies on his members to fund his really, and I mean this, really important work in bringing you sane, sober reporting on the Second Amendment on all things gun-related. Also, check out the Weekly Reload podcast on all your major podcast outlets and on YouTube. And if you're a member, you get it a day early.
Day early.
That's right. Steven, buddy, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you.
Thank you.